We'll call to order the Finance Committee meeting of Monday, May 24th, 2021, and ask Dave to call the roll, please.
Council President Abbas.
Present.
Alder Carter.
Present.
Alder Verveer.
Here.
Alder Furman.
Present.
Alder Curry.
Here.
Alder Figueroa Cole.
Here.
Mayor.
Present.
Mayor, you have quorum.
Thank you. All right. So we have, I'll just refresh once more, no public comment. So we'll move on to disclosures and recusals. Are there any disclosures or recusals from any members of the body on today's agenda? All right, seeing none, we'll move to the consent agenda. We have a number of presentations that we will obviously exclude from the consent agenda. But are there other items that alders wish to have excluded from the consent agenda? Alder Verveer.
Thank you, Mayor. Please separate agenda item number 3 so that I may ask a few questions.
All right, item 3.
Thank you.
Are there any other items that alders wish to have separated from the consent agenda? Seeing none, then let's just double check that the items that will be excluded from the consent agenda are items number 1, 3, 17, and 18. Any additional items? All right, so then on the consent agenda, President Abbas, a motion, please.
Move the motion to approve consent agenda.
Alder Carter, would you second?
Second.
Right, so the consent agenda with the exceptions of items 1, 3, 17, and 18 is moved and seconded. Is there any objection to recording unanimous vote in favor of the consent agenda? Seeing no objection, those items are all adopted with their recommendations, and we can allow a number of staff to log off. And we will go to item number 1, which is the Town of Madison Attachment Overview and Update. And it looks like Jeff Greger from Planning is here to give us an update.
Yep, I'll do the first half of the presentation, and I'll hand it over to Dave to finish up. We wanted to give this committee a briefing on where we're at with the final attachment of the Town of Madison. I'll be going over some kind of the mechanics of the agreement, what to expect as far as infrastructure and new residents, and then Dave will go over some more of the budget impacts to the attachment. Go to the next slide, please, Dave. So the map you see on your screen, it shows the areas of the Town of Madison that will be attaching to the City of Madison and City of Fitchburg. City of Madison parcels are in a light blue. Just note there are 2 areas that are not shown on this map that will be coming to the City of Madison, and those are Lakewood Gardens along Sherman Avenue. And then there's a few miscellaneous parcels on Hampshire Place, south of Schrader Road, that are also currently in the Town of Madison, and those will be attaching to the city as well. The attachment will take place on October 31st of 2022. So we're coming up here fairly quickly. Currently, the City of Madison is providing fire and EMS services to the entire town, as well as building inspection for the entire town, and that will continue until October 31st of 2022. As far as the town assets, those liabilities and assets will be allocated to both the city of Madison and city of Fitchburg. And we are currently meeting on a quarterly basis with the city of Fitchburg to kind of work through a lot of those issues. Another uniqueness of this agreement, the city of Fitchburg will own the town hall property and the fire and EMS assets. It's a bit away from the city of Fitchburg boundary. So it'll be a city of Madison property, but the current agreement, it'll be owned by the city of Fitchburg. Then as far as the town employees, those who are not offered employment with either Madison or Fitchburg will be entitled to a lump sum severance, and that's based off of years of service with the town of Madison. Next slide. Some of the interesting numbers, or you might find of interest. City of Madison will be getting about 5,000 new residents. That equates to just over 2,300 additional housing units and about 835 additional parcels, which works out to just under 600 acres of additional land. Some of the infrastructure we'll be getting, just under 12 miles of sanitary sewer mains, 3 sanitary sewer lift stations, about 4.5 miles of storm sewer pipe, 1 detention pond, almost 38 miles of streets, 1 bridge, and 2 parks. Next slide. And then just a little bit about the social economic characteristics, comparing the town to the city. There's a fair amount, just under a quarter of the population of the town is under the age of 18. And fair amount of 18 to 64-year-olds, pretty comparable to the city of Madison. Average household income for the town is about $42,000 a year, where the city of Madison $65,000. The percentage of folks living below the poverty line is fairly similar to the city of Madison at 16.8%. Housing tenure, majority of the residents in the town rent versus own, as compared to the city, where it's pretty close to the 50-50 split. Again, those numbers are 2010 census. We'll find out more when the 2020 census numbers are released, but it gives you an idea of housing tenure. Next slide, please. As far as race and ethnicity, the town is fairly diverse as compared to the city. And ethnicity, there's a significant amount of folks who identify as Hispanic or Latino, at 28% as compared to the city's 6.8%. Next slide. I just wanted to talk a little bit about the communication plan going forward here. The city staff has put together an awareness campaign that will be rolling out hopefully later this week. Staff has developed a new Town of Madison attachment website, which you can find under the City Hall section on the current city website. It'll be multilingual. It's translated into Spanish and traditional Chinese, as well. It will also be in English. There will be an interactive map. There will be discussions of any service changes they can expect, residents can expect. And then there's a few ways town residents can kind of subscribe to some updates. So we'll have email updates, text messaging updates. There's also going to be a voicemail hotline. And again, that'll be in Spanish, English, Tibetan, and Mandarin. And then this awareness campaign will be using geofencing ads, putting out short videos and picture posts. And that'll be through local news outlets, Google search, and social media. And those ads will be targeted to town residents. Also be hiring community navigators, and their job will be to have a presence in the town, distribute informational flyers, and answer any kind of frequently asked questions that folks may have. We'll also be putting together press releases and having regular public information meetings, both online and in person, as we continue on here until October of 2022. I'm going to turn it over to Dave to finish out here.
Thanks, Jeff. So turning to estimated costs of the attachment of the town, those portions of the town that'll be in the city of Madison and residents of those portions of the town. We did begin late in 2019, early into 2020, a service review where we asked all of the agencies to provide an estimate of the cost of providing what are current service levels in the city to the town. And we got that information and we used some of it in developing the 2021 budget. And more recently, we've been updating the numbers in that what we call inventory to reflect better estimates of costs of the final attachment. As Jeff mentioned earlier, the city is currently providing fire and building inspection services to the town. That includes emergency medical services as well as ambulance conveyance. Town revenues to the city, this is a very rough estimate. And it will probably change over time, but the estimate of what the city would receive as its share of the town's current levy, its current own source revenues, so those would be charges for services, licensing and permits and so on, as well as state aid, would be about $2.3 million. And that is net of what we're already receiving in terms of the town paying the city for those fire and building inspection services. Just a reminder that about 30% of what is the town will be going to the city of Fitchburg along with the associated proportional revenues. And the mayor's budget will include funding to address that transition to serving town residents that begins October 31st of 2022. Just to run through some of the costs, these are one-time operating costs identified by the agencies in that inventory process, and you can see the amounts by agency. The largest is for election equipment. Again, bringing town residents into the city means more people to serve in elections, more refuse and recycling containers from the streets division, and then updates to signs. So those are some of the costs that you see there. Other areas might be equipment and perhaps planning type studies and things like that. Turning to ongoing operating costs, again, these are figures provided by the agencies in terms of delivering the current level of services. You can see the number of positions by agency and then how that translates into dollars. In the fire department, just to highlight, that's the largest number, and that does reflect adding an additional ambulance to increase EMS services. And so that's a large share. It's probably about $1 million of that almost $4 million. And we're also continue to refine these numbers with each of the agencies as we move toward the attachment date and getting the 2022 budget put together. Here are some examples of those ongoing operating costs. More property being brought in from the town needs more assessments, and so those new parcels need to be assessed, and the assessor has identified a need for 2 new staff. Clerk identifies another 5 polling locations, so that ties to the equipment and the election officer support that's needed. In community development, this again is sort of looking at the population of the town and then looking at possible caseload needs related to childcare, for example, and youth and adult employment contracts. And if we maintain that service level, what the additional cost might be. Engineering, obviously, we're adding more miles of streets, and many of those streets have pavement ratings that are relatively low, and so they've identified a need for sewer utility staff, private development staff, contractors to repair sanitary sewer mains, and additional construction inspectors. I mentioned the ambulance as well as inspection activities. Library will have increasing share that it'll have to pay for the walk-in contracts in terms of part of the population that may, for example, go to libraries that aren't in the city. So this might be town residents that might go to the Fitchburg Library or something like that. And we have to pay for that. Additional citations through the municipal court and the workload associated there, parks, EAB mitigation, signs, and so on. Again, serving the town for public safety services. You can see the positions that the police department has identified. More staff in the streets division, again, to serve the town, and then the signage and so on. Bike racks, electricity for streetlights that the traffic engineering division identified. So this just gives you a sense of the ongoing operating costs and one time in 2022 through 2025. We do anticipate having to budget for some costs in 2022. However, the town will be still operating in 2022 for most of it. We don't anticipate getting any sort of town-related revenues until the very end of the year, those last 2 months. So not much revenue, if any, then. And the amount that's been sort of identified through this inventory process exceeds what we estimate through additional revenue from the town. So that is a process that will have to be gone through in building the budgets for all of this and decisions around how to allocate revenue towards these programs. There's also capital costs that have been identified, and you can see those amounts by year. It includes equipment for additional staff, the town infrastructure, which needs to be improved, and then issues around affordable housing, developer loans, land banking, in those areas of the town that are coming into the city. So by the time this fully ramps up, around $8 million a year, with much of that in those areas of affordable housing and land banking and developer loans. All right, that's a quick run through. Stop to share. And I think Jeff is still here, or maybe he's left. We can answer any questions.
Still here.
Thank you, Jeff and Dave. Questions starting with Alder Figueroa Cole.
Thank you. So at the very beginning, there was a point there made about Fitchburg and Shorewood that I missed while I was trying to connect to my multiple devices. Can you go back to those first few slides and explain? I mean, is Sherwood getting a part of it, or is the town of Madison going to continue to exist in that area? I lost that comment there.
Sure. So I don't, Dave, if you can bring up the slide with the map on it.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
So there are two areas that aren't shown on that map. One is the Lakewood Gardens on Sherman Avenue. That will be coming to the city of Madison. And then the other area is the parcels along Hampshire Place, south of Schrader Road. Those will also be coming to the city of Madison. October 31st of 2022, there will not be any more town of Madison at all. So it'll either be attaching to the city of Madison or city of Fitchburg.
So which ones are the city of Fitchburg? Has that been defined?
Yes, the parcels that are kind of in a pink or orange color, I'm not sure what those would be the city of Fitchburg parcels, or the parcels that the city of Fitchburg get. Everything else comes to the city of Madison.
Okay, thank you. And then I made a note in here. I don't know what that note meant. So moving on to the next question. What is the, when you guys talk about additional costs, how do you compare the additional cost that we're estimating versus the current way that the town is being run? Why is there such a huge discrepancy there on numbers?
Well, for grow coal, I think that's attributed to basically a higher level of service that the city provides relative to what the town provides, particularly in the areas of community development and economic development. So things like land banking, affordable housing, the community development services around childcare, and so on, as well as I said, the fire department wanting to add another ambulance, which is a significant share of that additional cost.
Okay, and then how about, I also heard earlier on something about staff moving or not moving. So are we like, for the clerks, for example, and the police department, we were asking for those numbers. So the numbers that we're estimating, are those comparable to the number of people that are running the town today? The same number of positions?
We probably, I think the police numbers are probably relatively comparable to the size of their police department. We could, we're continuously looking at that, but that's probably pretty close, maybe slightly larger in the city, what the city is proposing. The elections is probably more. We do more with elections in terms of services than probably the town does.
And then when this goes into the budget, then like for those specific jobs, positions, HR hirings, are they then come in the budget as a transfer from one bucket to the other, or are they come as a new expenses?
Well, these have been identified as new expenses. So in addition to what is currently being done by the city, and that's really the policy question that ultimately be before both the mayor and the council to some extent in the 2022 budget about how should those be meshed together and how far should the budget increase related to the additional residents from the town being added to the city.
Thank you. That's all I got for now.
I just want to make sure to clarify that the town government is going away, right? Anybody who currently works for the town is out of a job once we do this annexation. So we're not taking those people on. We're just taking on the job of providing the services. And it's up to us to figure out how we continue to provide those services.
Right. I mean, I understand that. I mean, so you also talking specifically about the positions, like the jobs themselves, not wasn't going down to the individual level.
Yeah.
Just the actual spots.
Yeah. But just to be clear, we're not taking the town government and saying we're bringing all those positions over. Mm-hmm. It's a department or agency by agency assessment of if they need additional capacity.
Right. I understand. Thank you.
Alder Curry, questions?
Thank you. Please feel free, staff, if this is too long for this meeting or as a follow-up. I guess I'm just curious about the actions that obviously predate my term to, like, why are we annexing the town of Madison?
I'll let Jeff field that one.
It predates all of us, Alder.
It's been a long process, starting almost 20 years ago. Jeff, do you want to?
I could take it unless Heather or Doran.
I am here. I can probably give a good summary of it. I've been dealing with the town for a long time. This dates back to the 1970s. Frankly, Paul Soglin back then had issues with the town of Madison, tried to annex it. That eventually led to the creation of the city of Fitchburg in the 1980s. After that, there was a series of border disputes where there were various annexations, challenges, court cases, which led up until finally in 2003, the parties, City of Madison, City of Fitchburg, and the town came to this agreement, which is what's coming to an end next year, called a Cooperative Plan. It's allowed for under state statute. Essentially, the town saw the writing on the wall that it was not going to be able to survive indefinitely. So it reached this agreement where it could essentially last for another 20 years and kind of wind down its business. So that plan was entered into in 2003 and approved by the state at that time. We came up to a final boundary agreement, a boundary line with Fitchburg, and there have been no annexation disputes since then. We've been working pretty cooperatively with Fitchburg on the town territory and with the town for the most part during the last 20 years. So it's led to a lot more stability and cooperation amongst the parties over the last 2 decades. But this agreement, as Jeff has noted, is coming to an end next October. So this, everything was set in motion about 20 years ago. There's a long history, I think, before that of just a lot of disputes and territorial fighting, which has certainly not occurred since then. This is the first of the boundary agreements that we have that's going to be coming to an end. I would point that out. The Blooming Grove one would be next in 2027. And then the Burke one is 2038. So there's 2 other ones coming down the pike of other towns that will also be going out of business, but the town of Madison would be the first one. So I hope that helps fill in a little bit of the background here.
It does. I'll definitely follow up because your comment about Blooming Grove shocked me a little bit. I thought that had already started, but I digress.
Blooming Grove, we've phased it. There's been 2 big phased attachments that have already occurred. Large chunks of former Blooming Grove is already in the city of Madison, but pretty much what's left now are the residential areas. Those will be remaining in the town through 2027.
Thank you.
All right, Alder Carter.
Thank you. I was just going to ask for you to do an overview on why this is happening for the new people, but that's already been done. Thank you, Dorn.
All right, Alder Verveer.
Thank you, Mayor. Thanks for the presentation, Jeff and Dave, and the others for being here that are working on this issue. I'll just state at the outset that the cooperative agreement does not predate me. I actually happily voted for it as a member of the council back in the dark ages. Sue Bauman happened to be the mayor at the time it was largely negotiated. So speaking of mayors, my question actually I think is best addressed by you, Mayor, and that is, as you know, your predecessor, Mayor Soglin, and previous mayors of Fitchburg were very interested at one time or another in perhaps reopening the cooperative agreement and looking at some parcel swaps, perhaps an obvious head scratcher in terms of how this was negotiated back decades ago is why the city of Fitchburg will own the current town holdings on Fish Hatchery Road, obviously adjacent to city of Madison parcels. Can you share with us, Mayor, is there any interest on the part of your office or the city of Fitchburg in renewing those conversations?
Thanks, Alder. There was interest on the part of the city of Fitchburg in revisiting the boundaries in a fairly dramatic way, which we were not interested in. I think there is general agreement between us that we need to work out the question of the town hall, that should belong to Madison. And so my understanding from staff, and staff can interrupt and correct me if need be, is that as we work through the final disposition of the assets of the town, that will be one of the items that gets traded, so that it does end up belonging to Madison. But we have not been interested in revisiting the sort of most pertinent boundaries between us and Fitchburg.
Thanks very much. Your analysis makes great sense to me, and I appreciate your position on this. So I look forward to further updates as the progress goes in terms of negotiating the town hall parcel.
Yes, Alder Carter will not ever let me forget that particular item. So it remains very, very firmly on the list.
Very good.
Yeah.
Thanks very much, and thanks to the staff again.
Thank you, Alder. President Abbas, questions?
Thank you. Regarding land swap, have we looked into MMST school district and see how Fitchburg and Madison and MMST school district will work together? We, as in just a reference, we have situation at Ramish Farm where with town of Burke, we have to do that adjustment. We were lucky to find, MMST was very lucky to, find that land in the forest. So I'm just curious if we look into that as well.
Alder, we already have portions of the city of Fitchburg that are served by the Madison School District. So I don't believe that's as much of an issue as it is on the north side. Jeff, do you have a sense of where the current MMSD boundaries are in relationship to the new city boundaries?
They go much farther south, I think, Post Road area. So it's south of the Beltline. I don't think it comes close to any of the parcels that we'll be receiving, so it'll stay in the Madison School District.
Right. So I don't think there's any significant change.
Okay, that's good to know. Thank you. And then one last question is about the existing police staff in town of Madison. They will be unemployed then in October, or and then we're going to start a separate process, City of Madison and other employees as well?
That's correct. We're not obligated to hire any of them. I believe that we will, as we have positions that might be appropriate, we would certainly consider them. But no, we're not just taking on the existing town staff.
Okay. And just Attorney Doran, just a curiosity question. I know town of Burke 2038 is the deadline, but we did some annexation like Ramish Farm, and then there was another one further north in Alder Mayatz's district that also interesting. How does that work? If we have a certain timeline, how could we take parcels out? I'm just curious.
Well, each cooperative plan has a little bit different agreements about the boundary and what can happen in the period before the town goes out of business. For Blooming Grove and Burke, we've allowed what's called like intermediate attachments. Same thing as town of Middleton. You'll see a lot of those. All of that development on the far west side is also under a cooperative plan. It kind of sets a different process for bringing the properties into the city. Town of Madison was unique in that there actually was only one large bunch of attachments allowed by the plan, and that was the Badger and Park Redevelopment District that occurred back in the mid-2000s. Otherwise, we've had just a couple of them just for specific developments. So every one's a little bit different. You'll see a lot more from Burke, town of Middleton coming forward, but each plan is different. And if you ever have questions about a plan, you can always ask myself or Jeff. Planning staff and myself, we deal with them quite frequently.
All right, I appreciate that. Thank you.
Thank you, Alder Furman.
Thank you, Mayor. As I look at these numbers, I'm hoping maybe Dave can provide a little bit of clarification how this will work with our levy limit. I mean, it looks like the revenue that we're going to get is not nearly enough to pay for the costs that we're going to have annually. What will our budgets look like to be able to obviously raise revenue from other parts, not just the town or the land that was formerly town? How will that work?
So, Alder Furman, the number I showed you, the 2.3 million, assumes that the town levy, that portion of the town levy, roughly 70%, would come to the city of Madison. We've begun a dialogue with the Department of Revenue on how the levy limit would be treated. They make the decision ultimately on how we can adjust our levy limit. to address the cost. I anticipate it will be solely that amount, that proportional amount of the levy that is attributable to that portion of the town that is moving to the city of Madison. And then our levy limit increases by that amount, and that's a part of that 2.3 million that I showed you.
And then how will we be able to raise revenue then for the other close to 2 million in costs?
We will not be able to increase our levy limit above that without a referendum. So that's what I mentioned earlier in response to a question from Alder Figueroa Cole. We may not be able to increase the budget that much, or the mayor and the council together need to make a decision on how those issues will be addressed within the context of the levy limits and our other limited ability to raise revenue.
My apologies that I missed that.
It's okay.
I didn't mean to ask the same question twice. And the other question is, so this request includes a 9th ambulance. What does that mean for the outstanding request that we've had for a long while of a 9th ambulance at Station 14? Do you have any information on whether or not fire still wants an additional ambulance at Station 14, or will adding a 9th ambulance here help move around how ambulance service works enough to help lower response rate?
Our understanding, but that's subject to further discussion, is that is the additional ambulance. So it wouldn't be 2 ambulances, it'd be 1, and that's what's reflected here. But again, that'll be a policy and budget question for you as a council.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions for staff on this item? Right, seeing none. Thanks again, Jeff and Doran and Dave. And I assume we'll continue to get updates as we move along. And obviously this will be a major topic of discussion in the budget process. So that will bring us to item number 3, which is Legistar 65507, creating a new classification of internal audit manager. And if we can get President Abbas a motion, please.
Motion to create a new classification of internal audit manager.
And a second, Alder Carter?
Second.
So moved and seconded. Alder Revere, you had questions?
Yes, thank you, Mayor. So these are obviously for Dave. First, Dave, I was very happy to see this resolution introduced at the last council meeting. As you know better than any of us, this position has been a revolving door in your agency for quite some time now. I certainly don't want to say that that's a reflection of you in any way, shape, or form. Can you just give us your personal observations? And I'll point out that the HR memo drafted by Tamika was very helpful. And so thank you for that, Tamika. Could you give us your personal observations as to how optimistic you are that if we engage in following, I presume, pretty much all of the recommendations that Baker Tilly recently laid out for us, that we will not only have a successful hiring process at this increased compensation level, but that we'll be able to retain a manager and after many years of not having any sort of real robust internal audit function, have one again in the future?
Thank you, Alder Revere. We're very confident. I think the plan that Baker Tilly put together for us and will lay a good foundation for this. I think the efforts of HR and Tamika in studying this classification and identifying the right pay level based on some limited outreach I did to those in the sort of private sector accounting community and some of the internal audit positions around the country that are advertised. This will be a competitive pay level. We further look to, we're calling this an internal audit manager. We expect we'll build this out with at least one or two more positions. I think that's been another issue, as it's really been of a scope that's too large for one position to address, or one position along with portions of other positions. And so we look to build that out as well once a manager is in place. So I think to answer your questions, we feel that the classification, the pay level associated with that will be competitive in this field, and we are hopeful.
That's great. Thank you for your optimism. Are there other recommendations laid out by Baker Tilly that you think are worth sharing with our committee at this time, or are the major recommendations already addressed in the HR memo and what you've reinforced for us, that it likely will take more than one manager reporting directly to you to ultimately get us to where we need to be?
Yeah, I think that was the, much of the Baker Tilly report was kind of their boilerplate of what a risk management system / internal audit system looks like. And, some of that I think goes beyond the scope of what we would have this position and unit perform, including, risks that can translate into financial risks, for example, in how we manage our information technology system, and other sorts of practices beyond simply our financial system, financial practices, and things like that. So I think the Baker Tilly plan and recommendations will be a good guide for us, and they do identify when they sort of looked at comparable sized communities, the amount of resource needs to go beyond one position.
And lastly, as you know, Chapter 4 of the ordinances does lay out a specific role for this committee in terms of the internal audit function. Do you foresee this committee once again perhaps resuming the role that we had back in the day in terms of an audit function? And as a follow-up, I'll articulate now, do the Baker Tilly recommendations yield your analysis that we would need to amend Chapter 4 in any way?
I think if you probably recall, Revere, the previous incumbent, this was probably about 3 years ago now, we had begun that process of engaging the Finance Committee, developing an audit plan, and that has been our goal all along, is to fulfill what's in that Chapter 4, as you pointed out. I think at this time we don't we don't contemplate any changes to Chapter 4 of the ordinance, but as hopefully we get somebody on board and who is focused on this, we'll see what happens down the road.
Thanks very much. Appreciate it and look forward to this hire. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you, Alder. Alder Carter, questions?
Yeah, I have just a quick question. Again, I just want to thank Tamika. This was very well done and very concise and clear. Dave, are we looking at hiring this person before budget season kicks off?
Well, the budget season kicked off today,
Yeah.
so no.
That was a trick question, but okay. You didn't fall for it. But when do you think that we will have this person on board, if all things are perfect?
Well, usually we have about a 2 to 3 week time frame for advertising the position, and so I think, for example, we just hired Christine Coe, who's our new budget manager, and she's at the meeting today, and we'll hopefully introduce her a little later in the meeting. But that process probably took a good, I want to say 3 months or so from start to finish. So once this is approved by the council and we begin that advertising phase, we'll obviously have initial interviews with the budget manager process. We did have stakeholder group meetings, which I found to be very helpful, and so did the candidates. And so that it'll be a process that I think will probably, hopefully, wrap up by early to mid-fall.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks. Are there any other questions on this item? Seeing none. It's been moved and seconded. Is there any discussion? Seeing no discussion, is there any objection to recording a unanimous vote in favor? Seeing no objection, we'll record a unanimous vote in favor of item number 3. And that takes us to item number 17, which is a briefing on the Federal American Rescue Plan Act. Dave?
Thank you, Mayor. All right. Yes, we will. We talked with you back on April 5th about the American Rescue Plan Act, and we were back again to give you an update. We've had a lot of information come out over the last roughly 2 weeks, and we'll go through that quickly today. All right, so that major piece of information is the U.S. Treasury. We'd been waiting for 2 months for guidance on the local government aid portion of the American Rescue Plan Act. Just to refresh your memories, the American Rescue Plan Act is a $1.9 trillion piece of legislation meant to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic, its economic effects, stabilize individual households, businesses, and state and local governments. And a major change in the American Rescue Plan Act compared to previous economic stimulus legislation in response to the pandemic is about a quarter of the funding is aimed at state and local governments, direct aid, and almost every local government in the country will be receiving some amount of money. And that is a significant difference from previous legislation as well as legislation during the Great Recession. So this guidance was released 2 weeks ago today. We learned that day that Madison's actual allocation from the $360 billion of state and local government aid is $47.2 million. The city, as you recall, will receive that in 2 tranches, of equal amounts. We've already received the first half, $23.6 million. And that has been deposited in the city. Obviously, it cannot be spent until it's appropriated, which requires amendments to the budget or inclusion in future budgets, which will be approved by the council. The second tranche will become available a year from now and paid to the city. There are 4 main areas where these dollars can be spent. I'll go into them in much more detail in the next few slides, but to quickly summarize, the first area is the public health response costs, as well as responding to the negative economic impacts of the pandemic. The second is premium pay for essential workers, and those are defined in particular workers who have had direct contact with the public. The third is maintaining government services, and the fourth is infrastructure investments in water, sewer, and broadband. And there are some specific guidelines around broadband related to megabits per second of upload and download speed, and I'll touch on those in a minute. The expenditure period begins March 3rd of this year, and it ends December 31st of 2024. And that is reporting through December 31st of 2026. Costs can be committed through 2024. That's the last date, but you can still spend on committed amounts through the end of 2026. There's also quarterly expenditure reports, and for cities larger than 250,000 in population, there are recovery plan performance reports. States also have to do that as well. So quickly running through some of the examples of areas on that first category of responding to COVID-19 or negative economic impacts. We have this containing or mitigating COVID-19, and you can see some examples there. It's areas the city has been spending on throughout this process. And a new thing that was added, a new concept or area of spending is behavioral healthcare needs. So the very much present mental health and substance abuse issues that may have arisen from the pandemic, crisis intervention, and so on. Paying payroll and benefits for those public safety and health workers that have been responding to the pandemic. And Treasury in its rules made it easier for governments to report on this. So it can be entire units that are primarily dedicated to COVID-19 rather than having to track individual employee time. In the area of negative economic impacts, there was a particular emphasis on tourism, travel, and hospitality, just given its considerable, how it's been considerably impacted by the pandemic. And some examples around safe resumption of those activities. So ventilation, personal protective equipment, and so on. Rebuilding the public sector capacity to pre-pandemic levels. In many communities and states around the country, there have been layoffs of public sector workers. And in this category, those staff could be rehired, as well as replenishing unemployment trust funds with these dollars in states that choose to do that. It includes small business support. So this is really focused on those negative economic impacts around loans, grants, in-kind assistance, and so on. And then really in those areas that are hardest hit, investing in socioeconomic disparities, so closing that, addressing disparities in education. There's a presumption throughout the rule that spending within census tracts that have measures that tie to these socioeconomic disparities are qualifying expenditures. Okay, the second area is premium pay. Again, this can be paid for retroactive activities. The employees are determined by the executive of that jurisdiction, and it can be provided either directly or through grants, for example, to private employers for essential work outside the public sector. And those are some examples that you see there. But again, it is about direct public contact in terms of who would be eligible for premium pay. There's also restrictions around how much premium pay can increase an individual's pay, both on a percentage basis to that individual, as well as how that pay compares to the average pay in the jurisdiction. All right, the third category is government services. And to identify how much can be spent on government services, there is a revenue calculation that tries to capture how much revenue has been lost because of the pandemic in the specific government. And so that calculation looks at all of the taxes and fees and other revenues collected by the jurisdiction. And but it does exclude a few things, namely water, electric, and transit utility revenues, federal aid, debt proceeds, and state-owned liquor stores. And so all communities and states need to do this calculation to see the extent to which these dollars can be spent on government services. We have done this calculation internally, and we have concluded that if you so choose, all of the 47 million could be spent on government services because of the amount of revenue that's been lost relative to that, what they call the counterfactual projection. Government services are defined in the rule as those that are directly provided to the public or as aid to citizens. Can also be used for capital projects, so to pay a cash portion of a project, And then some of the other examples are cybersecurity, school and education services, police, fire, public safety. But it's not limited to those. Those are just some examples. You cannot use these dollars to pay debt service or a settlement agreement or to directly replenish reserves or rainy day funds. And so you can't take this money and just put it into your rainy day fund. You can, however, use it to pay for the costs of government services that would otherwise be provided or paid for by local revenues, and then those unspent local revenues would then fall to fund balance and reserves, and that thereby replenishing rainy day funds. In the water and sewer infrastructure area, again, this is about a minimum level of service in these areas. Again, it would line up with EPA's already and programs that have been in place for many years around their clean water revolving fund and their drinking water revolving fund. Again, building or upgrading facilities, investing in wastewater infrastructure projects. And there's a lot of flexibility on how to use the dollars for that purpose. And then in the broadband area, again, it has to be spent on projects that result in the download speeds that you see there, and so that it's reliable service that assists households with internet access and digital literacy. So those are the four categories. In the reporting area, there first is an interim report of spending of the money through July 31st, and that's due at the end of August. After that, there will be quarterly reports of the spending, including contracts and subawards of over $50,000, the type of projects funded, and so on. And that'll be due at the end of October, and then subsequent quarterly reports 30 days after the end of each calendar quarter. And then, as I mentioned, there's a recovery plan performance report required. The first report due at the end of July. And this is really aimed at having states and communities larger than 250,000 in population identify the outcomes that they want from use of these dollars, how they're going to measure performance relative to those outcomes, and then reporting on that on an annual basis. And all of these reports are really about how how Treasury and the administration will in turn report to Congress on the use and effectiveness of these dollars. I'll run through these quickly. GFOA stands for the Government Finance Officers Association. I think I did touch on this back in April, but just a reminder that while $47 million is a considerable amount of money relative to what the city has ever gotten in terms of federal dollars, and many communities around the state and country would have got or have ever gotten. But these are one-time monies, and we need to keep that in mind as we think about either investments in the community to rebuild and build back better the community, as well as stabilizing the city budget. And I'll get into what those stability issues look like for 2022. There's a big emphasis on the fact that many different types of government, so school districts, surrounding communities, the state, are also getting considerable amounts of funding under these provisions of the American Rescue Plan Act. And just those concepts of partnering with other governments, regional approaches on issues to help leverage the expenditure of these dollars for, again, for that building back better. And then the fact that the money is available for the next over 3.5 years, and how to think about that over that span of time, and relative to rebuilding the economy and stabilizing budgets and so on. So some things to think about. These are, again, you saw this back at the beginning of April, but those of you who were on the committee and the council at that time. But it's really about restarting the economy, building it back better, small business recovery and development, emphasis on affordable housing and housing stability, really about climate sustainability and resilience in our community, looking at all of this through the lens of racial equity and social justice. And then the goal of comprehensive transit services. And just a reminder that, and we talked about this at the last Finance Committee meeting, but in addition to the $47 million that we're talking about in local government aid, Metro Transit is going to receive upwards of $70 million from the ARPA as well as the previous coronavirus relief and response federal legislation. And a plan's been developed on how to both stabilize Metro's budget and invest that for the future. And then, of course, the second prong of this, in addition to investing in the community, building back better, is maintaining the services that the city provides right now in the face of declining and slowly growing revenues, and as well as stabilizing our reserves and rainy day funds. So I'll quickly turn to a breakdown of the funding categories beyond the local government aid and how that's being looked at by our internal funding and recovery team and associated work groups. I won't spend a lot of time on this. Really, you can look at all of these, but this just gives you an example of all of the various categories. The first column is the recovery team that is responsible for this part of the bill and the American Rescue Plan Act. So you can see Economic Development Administration funding, Community Navigator Pilot Program. In a lot of these areas, rules are still being written. We're waiting for various federal agencies to give guidance on how the dollars will be made available and for what purposes they can be used. There has been rules written on the emergency rental assistance and utility assistance because it mirrors previous programs under previous legislation. And so we expect funding to come from that. And you've seen some of that from previous legislation already. Homelessness funding, emergency housing vouchers, direct homeowner assistance. All of these are being monitored by the recovery teams on the funding and recovery, the overall funding and recovery team. Assistance to older adults, connectivity funding, so that's internet, broadband connections, child care funding and stabilization money. We referenced the public transit dollars already, and there still are rules being developed there. A significant portion or large share of the ARPA is in public health response and building a better public health infrastructure going forward. And so considerable amount of funding there, but again, all of that, we're awaiting rules on how it'll be distributed and how it can be used. Fine. So that's ARPA. I just wanted to quickly run through, and many of you are already aware of this. Separately from ARPA, there is the federal appropriations process for the fiscal year 2022 federal budget. And both Congressperson Pocan and Senator Baldwin have asked for community projects. These are the three projects that Congressman Pocan is moving ahead with. And the next slide just runs through what has been proposed to Senator Baldwin's office for inclusion on the list that she and other senators are considering as a part of that community project process. So that's a quick overview of American Rescue Plan Act. The next steps is a strategy on how to allocate that local government aid, and the mayor and is considering how to proceed with that, and in conjunction with the council. The funding and recovery team has propose some approaches on use of those dollars, and more Treasury guidance will be coming out on all of this over the next few weeks to further flesh out and answer questions from local communities, state governments, and so on. This referenced earlier, but how to incorporate the ARPA funding into budget planning. Any sort of allocations for 2021, the council will see through amendments to the 2021 budget. And then any allocations in 2022 and future budgets will be through the regular executive and adopted budget processes. I think that's the last slide. So I will stop there. That was a very, very quick overview of a lot of things that are going on, but I'd be happy to answer questions that you might have.
Thank you, Dave. Alder Figueroa-Cole?
Thank you, Dave. Can we go back to the presentation a couple slides back where there was some breakdown of with dollar amounts, please?
I will share my screen again, and you can
say the third or fourth from the last one.
One of these slides.
Yeah, these things in here. So what does the amount reflect when it says federal funding? There was
so to take that first column that said, or first row that says economy and culture, economic development administration for economic injury. These are the national amounts. So that's $3 billion nationally is available for this program.
So, but is that included on the $23 million? I mean, on the $47 million?
Well, the $47 million is not on any of these lists. These are discrete programs separate from the local government aid.
Okay, perfect. I thought they had some caps already. Like I thought they were already classifying how to use the money, and they gave us some caps. Good to know. And can you define?
Just sorry, Alder, just for one small, more bit of clarification there. These programs are not necessarily coming to the city. We're not necessarily eligible for them. These are just the entire act. And we've been tracking so that we can make sure that if we are eligible, we can apply. But perhaps more importantly, if there are other entities in the city that are eligible, that we can encourage them to apply. And so just for example, the Shuttered venue grants, we've reached out to make sure that anybody who's eligible knows about them and can apply in our city. And there's a couple of other grants that would not be, that we as a city would not be eligible to apply for them, but others in our community would, and we've tried to make them aware of that. So not everything on this list is money that we could go after. But it's all potentially money that someone in our community could go after.
Good to know. Thank you. And can you please, Dave, define premium pay for essential workers? What's premium pay?
So that is basically pay added on to regular pay in response to, I think, the additional burden associated with having to have direct contact with the public during the pandemic.
But is there a cap on that? Is there like a certain percentage? Is that a number?
Yeah, there's a cap in terms of a total dollar amount that can be added to an individual's regular pay, as well as the percentage increase associated with it, as well as a comparison to what the average salary is in the community.
And I know you mentioned something about that we could spend the $47 million on fees that we haven't collected, but I mean, I know you were not, I mean, that is not something we really consider doing, right? Like we have so many other services that we can be allocating money to, I assume, right?
Alder, I think that we have to take a balanced approach. There are some lost revenues that or let me put it this way, there are some portions of our budget that are in pretty dire straits.
Mhm.
And I think it would be irresponsible not to use some of this funds to shore up some of the lost revenue. But there certainly are deep needs within our community that we need to use these funds to address as well. The concern, and I know that Dave says this every time, but it is really, 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 really important, is that this is one-time funding. And so we can't use it to establish programs that will be ongoing in perpetuity. We can't use it to hire staff that we will continue to employ without identifying another source of funding for those things. So it's a careful balance between, I think, filling in the holes that we have, meeting the needs that we have, and doing that in a way that doesn't set up a future structural deficit either for us or, frankly, for the agencies that we might contract with on community-based programs. So it's going to be a difficult balance for us to strike, I think.
So on that note, like again, when we talk about mental health services, which is something that the pandemic has really exacerbated, and the county has some efforts in that regard to have some programs and some capital expenses on that. How are we? What does it look like of your discussions or negotiations with those other agencies that we can partner with to maximize these funds, like MSSER and specifically the county? Do you guys have like ongoing meetings, or is that something that we as a finance committee need to be participating on? How does that work?
We have been trying to communicate with the other entities that are receiving funding at a minimum to understand how they plan on using that funding, but preferably to be able to try and collaborate a little bit more and to see if we can layer the funding in a way that would be synergistic. I will say that there's perhaps less interest in that than I would like, but I keep trying. And have most recently asked if we could get even a more regional conversation going around this. And so we will continue to reach out and to try and figure out a way to use all of this money to the best effect in our community. But obviously, it takes two to tango.
No, I appreciate that, and I don't want to speak for anybody else in this committee, but I hope at least from my perspective, anything that we can contribute to those relationships or processes, that's what we're supposed to be here for. So really, please let us know how we can moderate that. I know that we're having a lot of discussions on that in some of the committees that we're sitting on, and they all, not all of them, but many of them do end on the discussions of this money coming down the pipe. So as long as we are, we're on the same communication wave, I think that'll be all good. And then the last question I have, which I don't even know I'm going to ask this because it's a big loaded question, but I'm going to throw it out there. Is the public going to have any input on this? I mean, are we going to make any effort to bring them into a conversation?
But Alder, as Dave said, none of this goes forward without a public process, right? So allocating all of these funds will require either budget amendments or to be rolled into some future budget. So there's definitely a public process around all of it. I think what exactly that looks like, it depends on what approach we end up taking.
Thank you. That's all I got for now. Thanks.
Thanks, Alder. Are there other questions on the presentation? Alder Verveer.
Thank you, Mayor, and thanks, Dave, very much for your presentation. I really only, I think, have two quick questions. The first one is, and I don't know, you need to pull up the last slide in terms of next steps, But could we have perhaps a little better sense from you or perhaps the mayor as to how soon council members might see proposed budget resolutions relating to beginning to expend some of the ARPA funding? Could it be as early as next month, later this summer? Do we know tonight the timing of any of that in a more precise way?
I think I'm going to defer that to you, Mayor. I would say probably, sometime in June or July, we'd be ready to, move forward on some pieces of legislation.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Thank you. And then the other question is also for both of you, perhaps. Have we had any indications from the governor's office or state DOA as to, at this juncture, if there's any reason for optimism that perhaps local municipalities might be eligible for any of the pass-through ARPA funding that the state receives? Or do you think their position might very well be, we're all receiving these direct appropriations and the state has so many needs, just as we do here in Madison, that we likely won't be seeing the state provide us some of their ARPA funding as they generously shared with us in previous rounds of stimulus funds?
Alder, I think there's a couple of things going on that impact the answer to that. Firstly, the state received significantly less than was projected. We also received less than was projected, but not, I think, by the same percentage that the state did. So I imagine that they are in a little bit of a scramble to reconcile what the governor's already announced and what the amount of funds that they'll actually have. That aside, I have talked with multiple members of the governor's staff and several cabinet members as well about their plans and how they might choose to invest some of that in the city of Madison. All of it, I think, very politely received and no promises made. But definitely have been advocating for some state dollars to come through the city. And in addition to, potential sort of specific investments in Madison, advocating if they are going to, for example, continue to invest in rental assistance, that they work directly with us, either as a pass-through or as a partner on that, rather than doing their own process that would be separate from ours. So I feel confident in terms of the conversations with the executive branch, that we have a strong partnership there. I will say that we are getting warning signs that the legislative branch is looking at the amount of funding coming to cities and saying, oh, good, that means you don't need shared revenue. So I think that there is a significant danger in the state budget process that we could get funds cut on various fronts, in shared revenue and transit aid, perhaps other places, because the legislature is looking at these funds that have come to us and saying that we don't then need state money. So I think there's going to be a little bit of a push-pull here, and hopefully we can stave off cuts on the legislative side, and hopefully we can encourage investment on the executive side. But at this point, I wouldn't have any confidence in either.
Well, thank you very much for your advocacy, Mayor. And I'm sorry to hear your last point, but obviously it's not a surprise, I believe, to any of us that that's what some of the folks at the state capitol building are thinking these days. So thank you for that. If I could just say one more thing, I think this presentation obviously very much flows into the final presentation tonight, and I did have a chance to glance through those slides, very sober slides, especially as it relates to where we're at with the balances and the projections. So I appreciate that presentation as well. The reason I'm saying all that is that at a moment's notice, I might have to take leave here to go testify at the Plan Commission public hearing that's taking place as we speak. So I just wanted to thank Dave and the budget team for their next presentation as well, and especially want to welcome our newly minted budget manager, Christine, and say I'm very much looking forward to working with you, Christine, if I'm not here for the next presentation. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you, Alder. Alder Carter, questions on the ARPA?
Actually, my question was the impact of the shared revenue, which you've already addressed. So thank you.
Thanks, Alder. Any other questions for Dave on this item? All right, seeing none, then we'll go to our last item, which is a presentation on the 2022 operating budget. Dave?
Thank you, Mayor. You get to see me and hear me talk again. I apologize, but I'll try to run through this as quickly as I can. All right, you should be able to see that. So now we pivot to the 2022 operating budget outlook and the budget instructions that were communicated to the agencies earlier this afternoon. So we'll start with the outlook. When we talk about the budget gap, it is $18 million. And that is the difference between our anticipated revenues for 2022 and our costs to continue current services, as well as some additional costs that have been set aside for certain key issues. In comparison to 2021, we have a budget of a little under $350 million in 2021. But as you can see, about $8 million of our revenues was one-time revenues applied from fund balance in order to balance the budget. With those gone, while our revenues, our base revenues are going up, it's still less than the total amount available in 2021. And so we have that one-time issue to overcome, as well as the additional costs, which are primarily personnel related for continuing our services in 2022. Just to look at the entire budget from an expenditure and revenue perspective and how that breaks down. Again, personnel is the overwhelming share of the general library fund. It's no surprise given the services that are provided via those funding sources. And all other, so that would be our contracting costs with nonprofits, our supplies costs and so on is about $74 million. And then we have debt service on top of that of about $62 million. Turning to the revenue side, most of general library fund comes from the property tax levy, which is heavily controlled by the state. And I'll get into what those controls mean for the 2022 budget. Our other revenue, those would be our own source revenues, so charges for services. An example of that is our ambulance conveyance fee, licenses and permits. An example of that would be building permits, fines and forfeitures, which include parking violations and traffic moving violations and so on. And then state aid is a little under $40 million. And when you add that all up and compare that with our projected expenditures, we have a gap of $18 million. All right, so breaking that down a little bit further, overall, our revenues and fund balance, taking out that one-time $8 million from fund balance, means that we're actually seeing revenues overall decline about $3 million compared with the 2021 budget. The levy is going up $4.1 million, and our local revenue, so that's a combination of state aid and charges for services and so on, own source revenues going up about $1.1 million. Actually, that's just our local revenue. And then our state aid is going down about $300,000. That's primarily a reestimate. As we talked about, as the mayor mentioned, the legislature is currently working on the state budget. The governor had put in some significant increases in state aid to local governments. That has all been removed by the legislature and the Joint Committee on Finance. And so we're monitoring that process to see what will happen on the state aid front in the adopted budget, which will hopefully be passed this summer. The fund balance I talked about, that's a drop on the of $8 million. The property tax levy, the overall increase of $4.1 million. 1.7 of that is related to debt service. So that's really tied to how much debt we issue and what is happening with our debt service. So any decline in that does not mean there's more money available for other parts of the budget. It's solely tied to that element of our budget. And then what really grows, it's what is this 2.4 million, and that's from the net new construction calculation. And I'll get into how that is changing for this budget on the next slide. Again, local revenues, we are expecting parking violation revenue to begin to recover and almost fully recover by 2022. We also expect some growth in room taxes and other areas that combined result in about a $1.1 million increase. Not much of an increase, but still an increase there. And then state aid, as I already referenced, just a reestimate. Turning to expenditures, they are anticipated to go up almost $15 million or 4.3%, with more than half of that related to personnel cost to continue adjustments. And most of that is related to step and longevity increases that city employees receive based on their time in service with the city, progression through career ladders and things like that. There's also some money built into this estimate for employee compensation. There's also an amount built in for the town of Madison, at least to have an amount there when we're doing budget planning. And we have cost to continue adjustments for IT systems. We have maintenance contracts that need to be adjusted and subscription costs that need to be built in moving forward, again, to keep our systems operating. And then this continues funding for community agency contracts and grants. Debt service going up about 2.7 million. This will change. This is a preliminary estimate based on 2020 borrowing levels. We spend the summer working with the agencies, looking at all of the capital projects and determining how much we need to borrow to fund the projects based on where they're at in their in progressing with their various activities. And we will issue debt in September, and that will then determine what our debt service amount is going to be. And then we have these other cost to continue amounts of about $3 million, which you see there. This is just our projection assumptions, which I've touched on already in terms of the property tax levy, what's happening with state aid. On the expenditure side, we have built in some assumptions for increases in health insurance. We have a 4% increase built in. That's what we've seen over the last couple of years. We also have a small increase built in for pensions through the Wisconsin retirement system. And there is a change in police and fire health insurance contribution for commission staff per their contracts. That's also built in here as well. And then I just referenced the debt service, which we will be adjusting over the summer. So as I mentioned earlier, the big portion of how we calculate the amount of property tax levy available is what's called net new construction. And that's just the value of new buildings, new construction in the city. And the bars that you see here are the net new construction property value over the last 5 years. We use the value of new construction 2 years prior to the budget year we're in. We're obviously looking ahead on budget, and we only have actuals for the year that's happened. So when we look at that bar for 2022, that's actually the amount of net new construction value that occurred in 2020. That fell about 25% compared to the amount in 2019, combined with our increase in equalized value, because it's a ratio of those two numbers. But in any event, what has been about a 2% net new construction factor applied in the levy limit, and which was as high as 3% back in 2018, has fallen to 1.5% for the 2022 budget. And much of that can be attributed to the impact of the pandemic in the spring of 2020. It did slow down construction for a short amount of time, as well as the building permit process. And that has played out in the net new construction number that drives this year's or the 2022 calculation. That could change in 2023 and beyond, as clearly we are having more construction occurring, but we'll just have to see what happens with that. So that's a big part of what's happening with the allowable levy growth. The other thing I want to point out is that sizable fund balance applied in the 2021 budget. It's the second largest amount that we've had over the last 25 years. And that's what this graph shows, is our fund balance in the general fund. The dark line is the fund balance as a share of the budget. And our goal on that is this bright light blue line of 15%. And we have been slightly below that, 2014 through 2018. We did have an increase in fund balance. A lot of that was due to putting a one-time TIF payment into our general fund balance. But as you can see, by applying that $8 million, our fund balance is falling below 14%. And that is something we have to closely monitor. It is tied to our overall financial health, as well as our rating, our bond rating, one of the key factors there. So turning to balances and what happened in 2020, we've obviously finished 2020. In the general fund, we actually remained steady with revenues versus expenditures. But for the application of $8 million of fund balance to the 2021 budget, we would have been at about 16% relative to that 15% goal. With the application of fund balance, which we have to sort of show in advance under accounting rules, that's going to fall to below 14%. Now, the reason we were able to maintain a stable level in the general fund, with the exception of the application of the $8 million, is a combination of the amounts I referenced earlier that Metro Transit's receiving through the various federal economic stimulus legislation, about $8.6 million of the general fund subsidy to Metro. So none of that was paid in 2020. So that was $8.6 million. And then the state used some of its coronavirus relief fund money received through the CARES Act to give grants to local governments to help defray the cost of COVID-19 response. And Madison received a little under $5 million associated with that. So together, almost $13.5 million really helped stabilize the general fund. Again, that's one-time money in 2020. In 2021, we have the application of $8 million of fund balance, and that really sets up what's happening in 2022. In the parking utility and Monona Terrace, two areas of city government that have been heavily impacted by the public health restrictions in response to the pandemic. The parking utility, its fund balance has fallen by $10 million from pre-pandemic estimates. It now sits at $22 million at the end of 2020. Expenditures exceeded revenues by $7.7 million, plus they usually have a $2.5 million surplus. Monona Terrace has, basically wiped out its reserves, and their cash balance fell by $2 million in 2020 and is expected to continue to fall, as we'll see on the next slide, in 2021. So looking at 2021 for the general fund, now these are preliminary projections. We do quarterly projections. We did not do a full quarterly projection in the first quarter, but we will do one in the second quarter to see where expenditures are at relative to budget, as well as revenues relative to budget. But right now, based on the information we have a $4.8 million deficit in addition to the $8 million fund balance applied. So all of the things being equal, that fund balance will fall to below 12% of the 2022 budget by the end of 2021 if nothing is done. And the $4.8 million right now consists of the deferral of furloughs. The 2021 or 2021 budget, yes, includes $1.2 million of one-time compensation savings. And a portion of that was realized by putting many city employees on work share plans earlier this year. But the remaining $500,000 will not be sought out through furloughs. Secondly, there's about a $2 million overtime deficit in the fire department. And there's also in the police department, a salary surplus due to the pace of retirements being much faster than what was projected in the budget. Putting those two numbers together, there's a $1.7 million deficit between those two budgets. And then there's a revenue shortfall of about $2.6 million. That's primarily due to room taxes being less than what was forecast when the 2021 budget was put together. Turning to the parking utility, they are expecting yet another shortfall of expenditures exceeding revenues by almost $8 million. That means their fund balance will fall further to $14 million. Monona Terrace will have a $2 million cash deficit. And I mentioned room tax, it's expected to be about $4.4 million short. So Monona Terrace and room tax and general fund together, because Monona Terrace and room tax, those things will fall back to the general fund since there's no reserves there. The parking utility still has reserves, so it would not affect the general fund, but it's a sizable risk to the general fund in 2021, about 37% of that 2020 fund balance. Just a couple of pictures here to show you what's happened with the room tax in particular. In 2019, almost $19 million was collected. In 2020, $6 million was collected. So a 70% fall off in room taxes. We do expect room taxes to grow about 50% in 2021, but that's still about, as I mentioned, $4.4 million less than what was estimated roughly a year ago when the 2021 budget planning began. And really, it's a function of the public health restrictions, particularly in urban centers, remaining in place longer than in other parts of the country. And so a slower recovery in the tourism, travel, hospitality, leisure, conference sector. And that we're seeing that, and we'll see that in room taxes in 2021. Room taxes should pick up quite a bit in 2022, 23, and beyond. But still will be quite a bit less over the next couple of years compared to that baseline. All right, so that's a quick picture of where things stand right now from a fund balance perspective and deficits. And now we'll turn to the mayor's message and operating budget instructions for 2022. First of all, agencies will start with this cost to continue amount. So certain amounts will be added in, as I mentioned, for steps in longevity in the personnel area, for sort of contracts that they may need to adjust. So in the IT area, for example, maintenance contracts, subscription services, and so on. Agencies do have the option of transferring funding between their various services, but they can't exceed that budget target. Agencies will, the general fund agencies will be asked to propose reductions that equal 50%, or I'm sorry, 5% of each of their services. These reductions need to be ongoing. So not just in 2022. We had a number of one-time savings proposals in 2021, and that needed to be added back in 2022. And so agencies are being directed to offer up ongoing permanent reductions. Charging other agencies for activities is not an option. And if agencies propose shifting costs to other funding sources outside of the general library funds, that needs to be sustainable on an ongoing basis. Since public health is a joint activity between the city and the county, they will not be required to submit a reduction scenario. To give the mayor sort of a menu of possible options, agencies are allowed to ask for one increase per agency and to address critical needs and service delivery issues. They should first look at scrubbing their base for reallocations before proposing increases. And any increases should try to look at scaling and phasing options, as well as the implications of the proposal over the next 5 years and any sort of administrative and internal service agency support they might need associated with the proposal. So enterprise agencies, so those would be agencies that have their own revenue stream, such as the water utility, sewer and stormwater utilities, and so on. They need to submit plans consistent with their revenue projections, and they need to balance their budget within those revenue projections. And finally, rate increases should be carefully reviewed from an equity perspective, as well as a resident ability to pay. So enterprise agencies should look first to streamline their costs, become as efficient as possible before turning to rate increases. Other key provisions in the budget guidance to agencies, keeping racial equity and social justice as at the forefront of everything and the lens through which proposals are made. There are new equity questions that were added, as we would call added in the capital budget process, and these are also being applied in the operating budget process. And agencies are asked to apply those questions not only to the services that they're currently delivering, but also to any increased proposals and most importantly, towards any reduction proposals that they're making. Agencies are urged to look beyond their own agency and offer ways of cooperation between agencies to streamline services and save costs. Any sort of shift to other funding sources, as I mentioned, needs to be ongoing and supportable. And then what lessons that we've learned from the pandemic, how can we continue those positive lessons going forward to combine services and innovate in how we deliver services? And then finally, on the town of Madison, any sort of related costs to that, agencies will not be asking for that in their requests. All of the town of Madison items will be addressed through the executive operating budget process. Okay, just a reminder on the calendar. So the kickoff was today, and you're getting briefed today, so that's a good confluence of events. And agencies then have until July 9th to prepare their operating budgets. And we then will brief the mayor, the finance department will, on July 29th of what is in all of the agency budget requests. The agencies then have a dialogue with the mayor in early August, talk through their priorities, answer key questions, and so on. We then move to finance, the budget analysts, and so on, reviewing the budget request, coming up with proposals, and the mayor making decisions on a balanced budget during that time frame. And then that budget's introduced in early October at the first meeting of the council in October, and then moves to the finance committee, which will hold its hearings the second week of October. and then we'll be amending the budget on October 25th. And that October 18th to 22nd period is when Finance Committee members, along with council members, can offer amendments to the executive budget that'll be considered at that October 25th meeting of the Finance Committee. And then it moves to the council, with the council having the opportunity to amend the budget again. And that period of time is November 1st to the 5th. And then the budget is adopted in that second week of November. And we will be providing periodic updates to the council and the Finance Committee through the Finance Committee process over the summer. And then just a quick reminder, and this information you'll have, I sent this presentation to you, but these are the budget analysts. As I mentioned earlier, we have our new budget and program evaluation manager, Christine Go, whose first full day is today and joining us in this meeting. And then we have the 4 budget analysts that you see there, Betsy, Steph, Brent, and Ryan, and the agencies that they handle. And they will be your primary points of contact, for example, when you get to the amendment process in the fall, amending the executive budget. So I have talked a lot and given you a lot of information, and I'm happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thanks, Dave. Are there questions for Dave on the operating budget outlook or process? Seeing none. Thank you. And that is the last. Oh, Alder Verveer, I knew we couldn't get away without a question from you. Go ahead, Alder.
Thank you. I'm juggling the Plan Commission meeting, so I had to turn that volume down first. Well, thanks again, Dave, for the presentation. And I don't know if our newly minted budget manager wishes to introduce herself or not, but again, a welcome to Christine. I do want to also appreciate the fact that the finance department's website was immediately updated today to reflect the kickoff this afternoon and the mayor's formal budget message to division and departments. So thank you for that as well. I do have one question before I have to get to the Plan Commission again, and that is regarding the fire department overtime issue. Dave, could you give us your overview as to what's happening there? Is it the same old, same old? Obviously, we were hoping in our budget deliberations last fall that the initiatives that the department had proposed and the budget that we had adopted would address the fire department OT issue in terms of the timing of the next recruit class and salary savings and overtime management, et cetera. Could you just speak to that briefly, that your initial projection shows that it's continuing to be a major concern?
Right. And Alder Verveer, this really is COVID related. You may recall that all city employees were given 10 days of emergency paid leave. So that was really basically an add-on to leave balances, in addition to existing sick leave, existing vacation, and so on. And so employees throughout the city have been using this at various times. In the fire department, again, given its 24/7 operations, basically there's been more leave taken than what was anticipated when the budget was developed, and those time slots need to be covered. And in order to do that, you need to bring staff back in and pay them overtime. That's really what's been happening.
Thank you for the explanation. Thanks, Mayor.
Thank you, Alder. Good luck at Plan Commission.
Thank you.
Are there other questions for Dave on the operating budget outlook or process? All right, seeing none, then that is the end of our agenda. President Abbas, a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Alder Carter,
Second.
moved and seconded to adjourn. Is there any objection to recording unanimous vote in favor of adjournment? Seeing no objection, then we are adjourned. Thank you all. Have a good night.